The applause started before I even reached the ballroom doors. Through the glass panels, I could see my husband standing on the small stage with a microphone in his hand, smiling the same practice smile that had helped him spend 38 years climbing from a junior accountant to chief financial officer of one of the largest manufacturing companies in Columbus, Ohio. His retirement party was everything he dreamed about. More than 200 coworkers, former executives, clients, and family members had gathered to celebrate him. I had spent nearly 6 months helping organize every detail, from the menu to the photo display that stretched across the back wall. I never imagined I'd be leaving that same ballroom wondering whether my entire marriage had been quietly rewritten behind my back. The event coordinator waved me over. "Your husband was asking where you were." "I had to pick up the cake topper from the bakery," I said, lifting the small box in my hands. "Traffic was worse than I expected." She smiled. "Perfect timing. They're about to begin the family speeches." I slipped into the room without drawing attention. Richard caught my eye for a second. He nodded politely before returning to his conversation with several board members. It wasn't cold exactly. It just wasn't the warm smile he used to save for me. I'd noticed little things like that during the past year. But every long marriage goes through quiet seasons. At least that's what I'd told myself. Our son Ethan hurried over and hugged me. "There you are." Dad was getting nervous. "I wouldn't miss this." "You okay?" I laughed softly. "I've been planning this party longer than some people plan weddings. I'm just tired." He kissed my forehead before returning to his wife. For a few minutes everything felt normal. The slideshow played across giant screens. Pictures from Richard's first day at the company, family vacations, Christmas mornings, our wedding photo from 34 years earlier. People laughed. People cried. His coworkers shared stories about his leadership. I sat near the front, proud despite the growing distance that had quietly settled between us over the past few years. Then Richard's daughter Emily walked toward me. She was 42 now, confident, sharply dressed, and always impossible to read. Richard had been widowed before we met. Emily was 8 years old when I entered her life. I never tried replacing her mother. I simply loved her the best I knew how. Sometimes she accepted it. Sometimes she reminded me I never truly belonged. She smiled. Too politely. "I've got something Dad asked me to give you." I assumed it was a thank you card or maybe a note about one of the surprises planned for the evening. Instead, she placed a thick manila envelope in my lap. "You should read it now." I frowned. "What is it?" "You'll understand." She walked away before I could ask another question. The room erupted into applause as Richard finished another speech. My hands suddenly felt cold. I looked down at the envelope. My full legal name had been typed across the front. No return address. No handwriting. Just my name. I opened it carefully. The first page stopped my breathing. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Filed 3 days earlier. Richard James Walker listed as petitioner. My vision blurred. I flipped through more pages. Property division. Financial disclosures. Instructions requiring my response within a specific legal deadline. Every page carried the name of a law firm I'd never heard of. I checked the filing date again. 3 days. 3 entire days. He'd filed for divorce while I was arranging his retirement celebration. While I was confirming flower deliveries. While I was writing the speech thanking everyone for supporting his career. I stared toward the stage. Richard was laughing with people who had known us as the perfect couple for decades. My stomach twisted. Maybe this was some horrible mistake. Maybe someone had delivered the wrong envelope. I stood. The room seemed strangely quiet despite the music. I walked toward him. He noticed the papers in my hand. His smile disappeared. Only for a second. Then it returned. "We'll talk later," he said quietly. I searched his face. "Is this real?" "Please," he whispered. "Not tonight. Not tonight. I didn't want you finding out here." I almost laughed. "You literally had someone hand these to me here." Emily stepped beside him. "You should lower your voice." I looked at her in disbelief. "You knew." She folded her arms. "This is between Dad and you." Richard glanced toward the crowd gathering nearby. "We'll discuss everything tomorrow." I lowered the papers. "You filed for divorce before your retirement party." I had reasons. What reasons? This isn't the place. I realized something that hurt almost as much as the documents themselves. He wasn't sorry. He looked uncomfortable, embarrassed, impatient, but not sorry. Someone tapped a glass with a spoon. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of ceremonies announced, before dessert we'd like to recognize one final surprise. People turned toward the stage. I stepped back, unable to move. Then a man in a navy suit stood from one of the executive tables. He carried a leather briefcase. I assumed he was another executive preparing a farewell gift. Instead, he introduced himself. My name is Daniel Mercer. He paused. I'm corporate counsel for Hawthorne Industrial. Richard's expression changed instantly. Not panic. Something closer to alarm. The attorney continued. Before we conclude tonight's celebration, the board has instructed me to address a matter requiring Mr. Walker's immediate attention. Conversation stopped across the ballroom. Richard forced a smile. Daniel, perhaps Monday would be more appropriate. I'm afraid it cannot wait. The lawyer opened his briefcase. I'd appreciate it if everyone remained seated. A silence spread through the room unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Richard looked at the board members. None of them spoke. None of them smiled. For the first time that evening, I forgot the divorce papers in my trembling hands. Something else was happening. And judging by the expression on my husband's face, he hadn't seen it coming either. Daniel waited until every conversation had faded before removing a sealed folder from his briefcase. The room had gone so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the chandeliers above us. Richard stepped away from the podium and forced another smile. Dan, whatever this is, surely it can wait until Monday. Daniel didn't smile back. I was instructed to present this before your retirement officially takes effect at midnight. The board chairman, Harold Benson, slowly stood from his table. Please proceed. I had met Harold dozens of times over the years. He had attended our anniversary party. We'd shared Thanksgiving dinners when executives were traveling. He always treated Richard like family. Tonight he wouldn't even look at him. Daniel opened the folder. Approximately 6 weeks ago, Hawthorne Industrial received an anonymous compliance report alleging financial irregularities involving executive discretionary accounts. The word irregularities rippled through the room. Richard cleared his throat. I assume internal audit already resolved that. They did investigate. And Daniel looked directly at him. They found enough evidence to expand the investigation. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. Every company gets anonymous complaints. Daniel nodded. That's true. Another pause. Most don't include supporting documentation. I watched Richard's shoulders stiffen. For the first time in our marriage, I saw genuine fear flash across his face. Daniel continued. The investigation is still ongoing. No conclusions have been reached. However, under company policy, the board has voted unanimously to suspend your retirement compensation package until the investigation is complete. Gasps spread across the ballroom. Richard's retirement package wasn't just symbolic. It included deferred bonuses, stock options, consulting payments, and executive benefits worth well over $1 million over the coming years. Richard stared at Harold. You agreed to this? Harold finally met his eyes. It wasn't an easy vote. You think I stole from this company? No one said that. Then why humiliate me? Daniel answered before Harold could. Because the board believed informing you privately created a risk that company records could be altered before investigators completed their review. Richard's face turned pale. I've worked here 38 years. And everyone hopes the investigation clears you. But until then, Daniel slid another envelope across the podium. Your executive access is revoked effective immediately. Security badges. Company laptop. Corporate phone. Access cards. Everything had to be surrendered before he left the building. I looked around the ballroom. People who had been cheering for Richard 15 minutes earlier were now avoiding eye contact. The room had completely changed. Richard slowly placed his badge on the podium. This is unbelievable. Daniel remained calm. There's one more matter. Richard closed his eyes for a brief second. What now? We've been informed that your personal attorney recently requested copies of several corporate valuation reports. Richard frowned. So, the request coincided with legal filings concerning your marital assets. My grip tightened around the divorce papers. Daniel looked toward me. Mrs. Walker. Every head turned. I apologize that you're learning about this in such circumstances. I didn't know what to say. Daniel continued carefully. Because some assets listed in the divorce filing may overlap with assets currently under internal review, the board recommends you obtain independent legal counsel before signing any settlement documents. Richard snapped. That's enough. Daniel remained composed. My responsibility is complete. Richard took a step toward him. You had no business involving my wife. Daniel didn't raise his voice. Actually, the board's legal advisors believe she should be informed. Silence. Emily suddenly stood. This is ridiculous. She walked beside her father. You're destroying his retirement over anonymous accusations. Daniel simply replied. The evidence wasn't anonymous. Emily frowned. What does that mean? It means the individual who submitted the complaint identified themselves. Richard's eyes narrowed. Who? I'm not authorized to disclose that. Richard looked around the room as though trying to identify an enemy hiding among the guests. I had never seen him look so unsettled. The celebration officially ended without anyone announcing it. Guests quietly collected their coats. Conversations turned into whispers. People avoided us. Some offered awkward hugs. Others slipped out without saying goodbye. The giant cake I had spent weeks designing remained untouched. Nearly half the floral arrangements were still wrapped in ribbon. Within 30 minutes, the ballroom was almost empty. Only immediate family remained. Richard finally turned to me. We should go home. I looked at him. Home? Yes. As if tonight didn't happen? He rubbed his forehead. We've both had enough surprises. I held up the divorce petition. I wasn't surprised. His jaw tightened. I was going to explain. When? He didn't answer. Emily stepped between us. Dad doesn't owe you every detail. I looked at her. I helped raise you. And I'm grateful. Her tone suggested she wasn't. But this marriage hasn't worked for years. I blinked. You knew. She hesitated only a moment. Yes. How long? She looked at her father before answering. About 8 months. 8 months. For 8 months they had both smiled across dinner tables, celebrated birthdays, spent Christmas together, watched me plan this retirement party, knowing he intended to leave me. The realization hurt more than the divorce itself. Ethan walked over. What are you talking about? Emily sighed. Dad filed for divorce. Ethan stared at his father. You what? Richard spoke quietly. I plan to tell everyone after retirement. You let Mom organize this entire party. I didn't ask her to. I couldn't believe those words came from the man I'd stood beside for more than 3 decades. No, I said softly. You just let me. Ethan's face hardened. Dad. That's cruel. Richard looked exhausted. This marriage ended years ago. I answered before I could stop myself. No. You ended it years ago. I just didn't know. No one spoke. The ballroom staff began clearing tables around us. The music had stopped. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Richard picked up his coat. We're discussing this tomorrow. He started walking toward the exit. Emily followed him. Neither looked back. Ethan stayed with me. After several minutes, he quietly asked, Mom, did you know any of this? I shook my head. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders. I'll drive you home. When we arrived, the house felt strangely unfamiliar. Richard hadn't returned yet. I wandered through the living room, noticing details I'd ignored for years. His filing cabinet was locked. His home office door was locked too. That had never happened before. Ethan noticed it immediately. He never locked this room. No. He looked at me. Something's wrong. I nodded slowly. It is. As Ethan left for the night, he hugged me tighter than he had since he was a teenager. If you need anything, call me. After he drove away, I couldn't sleep. Around 1:30 in the morning, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the dark kitchen. That's when I remembered something. About 3 months earlier, Richard had asked me to clean out old boxes from the garage because he wanted more storage space. I hadn't finished. Several boxes were still stacked behind the workbench. Mostly old tax records, family albums, retirement paperwork. Looking for anything to distract myself, I carried one dusty box into the kitchen. Inside were ordinary folders, until I reached a plain brown envelope with no label. It felt heavier than paper alone. When I opened it, a small silver flash drive slid onto the table. Attached to it was a yellow sticky note written in handwriting I recognized immediately. It wasn't Richard's. It belonged to his longtime executive assistant, Linda. The note contained only 7 words. If anything happens, don't let him erase this. I stared at the flash drive for so long that my tea went cold. Linda Harper had worked with Richard for almost 22 years. She wasn't just his executive assistant. She managed his calendar, coordinated board meetings, booked every business trip, and probably knew more about the company than most vice presidents. She had retired 4 months earlier. Richard had insisted on hosting a private dinner for her family. He'd called her the backbone of the executive office. So why would Linda leave me a flash drive with a message that sounded like a warning? My first instinct was to call Richard. My second instinct was not to. For the first time since we'd met, I realized I no longer knew which version of my husband was real. The one who used to bring me coffee every Saturday morning? Or the one who had secretly filed for divorce while I planned the biggest celebration of his life? I carried my laptop to the kitchen table and plugged in the drive. A folder opened automatically. It wasn't labeled with a person's name. Simply read, Executive Archive. Inside were dozens of files, meeting minutes, email chains, financial spreadsheets, scanned letters. Most of it meant nothing to me. I almost closed the folder until I noticed another file. It had been marked with a bright red star. Its title caught my attention immediately. Property Transfer Timeline. That made no sense. Richard and I owned one home. A lake cabin we'd sold years ago. Nothing else. Curious, I opened it. The first page listed several properties. Not company buildings, but private real estate investments. 3 rental houses. A commercial warehouse. 2 undeveloped lots outside Columbus. Each property showed ownership percentages. One name appeared again and again. Richard James Walker. Another name appeared beside his. Emily Walker. Not mine. Never mine. I frowned. Richard had always told me those investments were held inside retirement funds that couldn't easily be accessed. Apparently that wasn't true. The document showed transfers stretching back nearly 7 years. Small ownership changes. 5%, 10%, 15%, until Emily controlled nearly half of everything. I leaned back in my chair. Why would he quietly transfer property to his daughter? Parents help children all the time. That wasn't illegal. But why hide it? Then I noticed the dates. Several transfers had happened only weeks after we'd updated our wills. I remembered sitting in an attorney's office together. Richard had smiled across the table. We'll always protect each other. Now I wondered whether he'd been protecting someone else. I kept reading. Another folder contained emails. Most were routine. Then one subject line made my pulse quicken. Asset separation strategy. I clicked. The email wasn't from Richard. It came from someone named Mark Ellis. The signature identified him as a private financial consultant. The message read, Asterisk, continue transferring non-marital investment interests before formal filing. Once proceedings begin, disclosure becomes significantly more complicated. Asterisk. I read it twice, then 3 times. I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't know whether anything about that email was improper, but it certainly sounded deliberate. There were several replies. Richard wrote only one sentence. Asterisk, we're still on schedule. Asterisk. Schedule. The word echoed in my mind. A schedule for ending our marriage? Or something else? Before I could think further, my phone rang. The screen showed Ethan. Mom. I couldn't sleep either. You okay? I found something. What kind of something? I'm not sure. I hesitated. I think you should come over. 30 minutes later, Ethan sat beside me reading the same documents. He frowned deeper with every page. Finally he looked up. Did Dad ever tell you about these properties? No. He told me years ago he wasn't buying real estate anymore. So he lied to both of us. Ethan opened another spreadsheet. His expression changed. Wait. What? Look at this. He pointed toward a column labeled beneficiary updates. Most names were familiar. Emily. Several trusts. Investment accounts. Then one line froze us both. Primary emergency contact removed. Date. 11 months earlier. My name had been deleted. Emily's name had replaced it. Without telling me, I remembered Richard's business trips, his annual executive conferences, his medical checkups. Every emergency form had always listed me. Apparently not anymore. Ethan shook his head. This doesn't make sense. No. It feels like he was slowly removing you from every part of his life. I swallowed hard, without letting me notice. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Then Ethan asked the question I'd been avoiding. What if this has nothing to do with the divorce? I looked at him. What do you mean? What if Dad thought the company investigation was coming? The possibility settled over the room. If Richard expected an investigation, had he been moving assets beforehand? I immediately rejected the thought. No. Richard was careful, ethical, disciplined. Wasn't he? The man I'd married believed receipts should be kept for 7 years. He returned extra change if a cashier made a mistake. He once drove 20 miles back to a restaurant because they'd forgotten to charge him for a bottle of wine. People like that didn't hide money, did they? At 9 o'clock that morning my phone rang again. This time it was an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. Mrs. Walker? Yes. My name is Sarah Bennett. The name sounded familiar. I'm an attorney. I closed my laptop. What can I do for you? I represent Linda Harper. I sat upright. Linda? Yes. She retired. There was a brief silence. I'm afraid you haven't heard. Heard what? Linda passed away 3 weeks ago. The words hit me unexpectedly. What? She suffered a stroke. I covered my mouth. Linda had seemed perfectly healthy. When? 3 weeks ago. I had no idea. She requested that I contact you if certain events occurred. Every nerve in my body tightened. What events? The filing of your divorce. I looked toward the flash drive. She left me something. I suspected she had. Sarah's voice remained calm. Mrs. Walker, before Linda died, she signed a sworn statement. A statement about what? She believed certain financial records were being intentionally concealed. I closed my eyes. This is about Richard. Partially. The statement mentions several people. I stood and began pacing. Why didn't she go to the authorities? She did. I stopped walking. What? She met with outside investigators nearly 2 months before her death. My heart pounded. The anonymous complaint. It wasn't anonymous. It was Linda. Sarah sighed softly. Yes. I remembered Daniel's words from the retirement party. The evidence wasn't anonymous. He had been telling the truth. Sarah continued. Linda believed someone inside the executive office was manipulating records related to executive compensation and personal investment disclosures. Did she accuse Richard? She provided documents. That's not the same thing. No. I appreciated her honesty. So what happens now? That's partly why I'm calling. She paused. Linda also instructed me to advise you not to sign any divorce agreement until independent forensic accountants review your marital assets. Exactly what Daniel had suggested. Exactly what Ethan feared. I felt as though invisible pieces were slowly fitting together. Not enough to reveal the full picture. Just enough to make me realize there was a much larger one. Before hanging up, Sarah added one final sentence. Oh. There's someone else who asked about you yesterday. Who? A federal investigator. The kitchen suddenly felt very small. What did they want? They only asked one question. What question? Sarah's voice grew quieter. They wanted to know whether you knew about a safety deposit box registered only in your husband's name. I didn't answer Sarah right away. A safety deposit box? In 34 years of marriage, Richard and I had shared everything that mattered. Or at least I believed we had. We had a joint checking account, a joint savings account, and a fireproof safe in our home where we kept our passports, insurance policies, and copies of our wills. I had never heard him mention a safety deposit box. "Mrs. Walker?" Sarah asked gently. "I'm here. I don't know what's inside it." "Did the investigator say where it was?" "No. Only that it exists." "Why would they ask me?" "I suspect they're trying to determine whether you were aware of your husband's financial affairs." "I wasn't." "I believe you." After we hung up, I sat in silence. Every answer I uncovered seemed to create 3 new questions. Ethan looked at me. "What now?" "I need a lawyer. And someone who understands financial investigations." I nodded. For the first time in my life. By that afternoon, I was sitting across from Margaret Collins, a family attorney Ethan's father-in-law had recommended years earlier. Margaret was in her early 60s with silver hair, calm eyes, and the kind of confidence that made people stop talking and start listening. She read through the divorce petition without interrupting. Then she looked at the documents from the flash drive. She took much longer. Finally, she folded her hands. "Mrs. Walker, I have 2 separate opinions." "I'm listening." "As a divorce attorney, I strongly advise you not to respond until we've completed our own financial review." "And the second opinion?" She tapped the property records. "These concern me." "Why?" "If these transfers occurred using marital assets without your knowledge, they may become highly relevant during property division." "So they could be reversed?" "Possibly." "Possibly." She smiled slightly. "Courts prefer evidence over assumptions." That sounded fair. "And if there's evidence? Then we'll present it." She paused before adding, "I also recommend hiring a forensic accountant." I couldn't help laughing. 2 days ago, I thought forensic accountants only existed in television shows. They're very real. And expensive? They can be. I sighed. "My husband controls most of our money." Margaret shook her head. "Not anymore." "What do you mean?" "The moment he filed for divorce, financial disclosure obligations began. So he can't simply move money around? If he does after filing, that creates additional legal problems." For the first time since opening the divorce papers, I felt a tiny sense of stability. Not hope, just direction. As I left her office, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Richard. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Hello. We need to talk." "I'm talking. Not over the phone. I'm with my attorney." There was a long pause. "You hired a lawyer already? You filed for divorce already?" He exhaled slowly. "Emily says you're digging through old files." "I'm trying to understand my own life." "Linda manipulated you." I stopped walking. "What?" "She hated how the company treated her after retirement. She retired with a standing ovation." "You don't know everything." "Neither do you, apparently." His voice hardened. "I need those documents." "The ones Linda left?" "Yes. They're not yours. They contain confidential company information." I realized something important. He hadn't asked whether I was okay. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't explained the divorce. The only thing he wanted was the flash drive. "I'm keeping it. Claire." He hadn't used my name like that in years. "Please." "Why?" "Because this has become bigger than you understand." I answered quietly. "I think that's exactly why I'm keeping it." He hung up. Margaret had overheard enough of the conversation to understand. "He's worried." "You think so?" "I know so." That evening, Ethan insisted I stay at his house. "You shouldn't be alone." "I'll be fine. Humor me." His wife, Rachel, greeted me with a warm hug and homemade soup. It was the first meal I'd managed to finish since the retirement party. Around 8 that night, the doorbell rang. Rachel answered it. A minute later, she returned looking confused. "There's a woman asking for you." "Who is it?" "She says her name is Karen Douglas." The name didn't mean anything to me. I stepped onto the porch. Karen looked to be in her late 50s. She held a worn leather purse with both hands. "You don't know me," she said. "No. I worked at Hawthorne." "In accounting?" She nodded. "I retired last year." I waited. I almost turned around 3 times before knocking. Why? She glanced toward the street. Because I don't want anyone seeing me here. Every instinct told me to listen. Please come inside. She shook her head. I can't stay. Instead, she handed me a large sealed envelope. Linda wanted you to have this. I stared at it. You knew Linda? We worked together for 26 years. Why didn't you contact me earlier? I was afraid. Afraid of what? Karen looked me directly in the eyes. People losing their jobs. Over what? She lowered her voice. Linda wasn't the only person asking questions. A chill ran through me. There were others? 3 of us. What happened? One resigned. The other. He accepted a settlement agreement. And Linda? Karen looked down. Linda refused. She took a slow breath. She kept copies. Copies of what? Everything. My hands tightened around the envelope. Karen continued. If those records are inside, they'll explain why Richard wasn't the only executive investigators were watching. That caught me completely off guard. You mean this isn't only about him? No. It's bigger. Much bigger. Before I could ask another question, Karen reached into her purse again. This time she handed me a folded photograph. It had clearly been printed from security camera footage. The image showed the entrance to a downtown bank. The date stamp in the corner was from 5 months earlier. Richard was standing beside another man I recognized immediately. Mark Ellis, the financial consultant who had emailed him about the asset transfer strategy. But that wasn't what made my heart stop. Standing on Richard's other side was someone I never expected to see. Daniel Mercer, the company lawyer who had publicly suspended Richard's retirement benefits. The 3 men were entering the bank together, and according to the timestamp, it had happened months before Daniel acted surprised at the retirement party. I looked up at Karen. Why would the company lawyer meet them at a bank? Karen swallowed. That's the question Linda couldn't answer. She turned and walked toward her car. Halfway down the driveway, she stopped without looking back. Oh, one more thing. What is it? The safety deposit box the investigators asked about. Yes. Karen finally turned around. It isn't registered to just one person anymore. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? She looked at me with an expression somewhere between sympathy and concern. Someone was added as a co-owner 2 weeks before your husband filed for divorce. I barely managed to speak. Who? Karen's answer left me frozen on the porch. It wasn't Emily. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope Karen had given me sat unopened on the dining room table while everyone else in Ethan's house went to bed. Rachel had offered to stay up with me, but I couldn't ask that of her. She had work in the morning, and I knew she was only pretending not to worry. I kept staring at the security photo. Richard, Mark Ellis, Daniel Mercer, walking into the same bank together. 5 months before the retirement party. If Daniel had already met with Richard, why had he acted like they were strangers carrying out company business? Either there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, or I was looking at a picture that changed everything. I finally opened Karen's envelope. Inside were several folders, each carefully labeled in Linda's handwriting. One read board compensation. Another set property records. The thickest folder simply said, personal notes if necessary. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first page wasn't a financial document. It was a letter. Linda had addressed it to me. Claire. Asterisk if you're reading this, then Richard has probably filed for divorce, or events have reached the point where I can no longer explain them myself. Asterisk. I swallowed hard. Asterisk. I struggled for months over whether to involve you. I always believed you were being kept in the dark. You deserved better than learning the truth through rumors. Asterisk. Tears filled my eyes. Linda continued. Asterisk. I cannot tell you Richard is guilty of a crime because I don't know that he is. What I know is that he stopped asking questions he should have asked, signed documents he should have examined more carefully, and trusted people who benefited from his silence. Asterisk. I read that paragraph 3 times. It wasn't what I expected. Linda wasn't describing a mastermind. She was describing a man who had gradually compromised himself. That sounded painfully like Richard. He had spent the last few years talking about how exhausted he was, how much he wanted retirement, how he hated conflict with the board. Had someone taken advantage of that? Or had he simply chosen the easier path? The next page answered another question. Asterisk, do not assume Daniel Mercer is your enemy. Asterisk. I looked again at the bank photograph. Linda had anticipated exactly what I would think. Asterisk, if you find evidence showing Daniel with Richard, remember that company attorneys often meet executives regarding legal matters. One photograph never tells the whole story. Asterisk. I exhaled slowly. She was right. I had almost jumped to a conclusion. Linda went on. Asterisk, the person I feared most isn't Richard. Asterisk. That sentence made me sit up. Asterisk. It's the person who always stayed just outside every important decision. Asterisk. There was no name. Only that sentence. I turned the page. The remaining notes were handwritten observations, dates, meeting summaries, conversations. Several names appeared repeatedly. Harold Benson, Mark Ellis, Daniel Mercer, Emily, Richard. One name, however, appeared more often than anyone else's. Victor Lang. I frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Then I remembered. Victor Lang had been the chairman of Hawthorne's investment committee until he retired 2 years earlier. I'd met him only twice. Quiet, charming, forgettable. Why would Linda mention him nearly 40 times? The following morning Margaret called. I have good news. I could use some. The court approved our request to preserve marital assets. What does that mean? It means neither side can quietly sell, transfer, or hide major assets without risking serious consequences. So the properties are protected? For now. That was the first genuinely positive news I'd received. Then Margaret added something else. I've also spoken with a forensic accountant. When can they start? They already have. I smiled for the first time in days. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. What happened? They found an inconsistency. My smile disappeared. What kind? One investment account appears to have reported 2 different values. I don't understand. Neither do they. Is that illegal? Not necessarily. But if someone intentionally understated its value during divorce planning, it becomes very important. I looked toward Linda's folders. Everything seemed connected, but not clearly. Not yet. Later that afternoon, there was another knock at Ethan's front door. This time it was Richard. He looked 10 years older than he had at the retirement party. His suit was wrinkled. His beard had started growing in. His eyes looked tired. Ethan answered before I could. Dad, I'd like to speak with Claire. I'm here, I said, stepping into the hallway. Richard looked at our son. Can we have a few minutes? Ethan looked at me. I nodded. He and Rachel quietly moved into the backyard. Richard stood silently for several seconds. Finally he spoke. I never wanted any of this. I folded my arms. You filed for divorce. Yes. You hid assets. I didn't hide anything. You transferred property. I had financial advisors. Who told you not to tell your wife? His face tightened. It wasn't like that. Then explain it. He looked down at the floor. I thought I was protecting everyone. Everyone except me. He didn't argue. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen table. I made mistakes. Which ones? I trusted people. Who? He hesitated. I can't. You can't? Or you won't? If I start naming people now. He stopped himself. What? You'll be dragged into something much worse. I almost laughed. Richard, I'm already in it. He looked around to make sure no one else was listening. The divorce. What about it? It wasn't only my idea. I stared at him. What does that mean? I was advised. By who? That separating our finances quickly would protect you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Protect me? Yes. By divorcing me without warning? I know how that sounds. It sounds ridiculous. He rubbed both hands over his face. I thought the investigation would end quickly. So you expected me to forgive everything afterward? No. Then what? I thought. His voice cracked for the first time. I thought if everything went wrong, at least you wouldn't lose everything with me. I didn't know whether to believe him. Part of me wanted to. Another part remembered the 8 months of lies. The hidden property transfers. The emergency contacts. The secret planning. You had plenty of opportunities to tell me the truth. I know. But you didn't. I was ashamed. We sat in silence. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me. Who's the co-owner of the safety deposit box? Richard looked genuinely surprised. How do you know about that? So there is one. He closed his eyes. I can't answer. Can't. If I tell you. He looked toward the window. Someone else gets hurt. Before I could respond, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Every bit of color drained from his face. He declined the call immediately. Who was it? I asked. No one. The phone rang again. Same number. This time I caught a glimpse of the contact name before he turned the screen away. V. Lang. Victor Lang. Richard stood up immediately. I have to go. So that's who's been advising you? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked quickly toward the front door. Halfway outside, he turned back. Claire. Yes. For 34 years. I never stopped loving you. The words should have meant everything. Instead, they raised one painful question. If that's true, I said quietly, why were you willing to let me believe you stopped? He had no answer. He got into his car and drove away. That evening, Margaret called again. Her voice sounded unusually serious. Claire, where are Linda's original files? With me. Keep them somewhere secure. Why? Our forensic accountant found something hidden inside one of the scanned documents. What? A digital signature. I don't understand. It proves one financial authorization was electronically approved. She paused. 3 days after the executive who supposedly signed it had already died. The silence after Margaret's last sentence lasted so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Margaret. I'm here. Tell me I misunderstood. I wish I could. A dead man signed a financial authorization? According to the metadata, yes. I sat down before my knees gave out. Could it be a computer error? Our forensic accountant considered that first. And they examined the original file, the server timestamps, and the audit log. What did they find? The signature wasn't added accidentally. I closed my eyes. It was inserted. Yes. That meant someone had intentionally created a document that appeared legitimate. Not only was the company investigation bigger than Richard, it was beginning to look like someone had manipulated official records. Margaret continued. Federal investigators have already requested copies of the forensic report. So they know. They're beginning to. After we hung up, I looked around Ethan's kitchen. Only a week earlier, I had been choosing flowers for a retirement party. Now I was discussing digital evidence with lawyers. Life could change so quietly that you didn't notice it until there was no path back. The next morning, Margaret called again. This time it's good news. I'll take any good news. The court scheduled an emergency hearing regarding temporary financial orders. When? Tomorrow. Will Richard be there? Yes. What about the company? They won't participate. I nodded. This is strictly your divorce case. The courthouse felt smaller than I remembered from jury duty years ago. Richard arrived with his attorney but avoided looking at me. Emily sat behind him. She looked tired. Not angry. Just exhausted. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Margaret calmly presented evidence that significant marital assets had been transferred before the divorce filing. Richard's attorney argued they were legitimate estate planning decisions. Then Margaret introduced the timeline Linda had preserved. The judge spent several minutes reading it without speaking. Finally, she looked at Richard. Mr. Walker, were these transfers disclosed to your wife when they occurred? Richard answered honestly. No. Were they discussed with her? No. The judge made several notes. Then she looked at both attorneys. Until the financial review is complete, all disputed assets remain frozen. That wasn't a final victory, but it prevented anything else from disappearing. Outside the courtroom, Richard caught up with me. I need 5 minutes. Margaret looked at me. It's your decision. I nodded. She stepped a short distance away. Richard looked older than ever. I've been interviewed twice. By investigators? He nodded. They asked about Victor. So tell them. I did. I searched his face. What did you tell them? The truth. And what's that? He took a long breath. Victor convinced several executives to move investments through outside partnerships. Were they legal? I believed they were. And now? I don't know. For the first time, I believed he was telling me the truth. Not the whole truth, but the truth as he understood it. I never took company money. I want to believe you. I know. I just don't know if I can. His eyes filled with tears. I should have told you everything the moment I became uncomfortable. Why didn't you? I kept thinking I could fix it before you ever knew. Instead, he'd created a secret large enough to destroy our marriage. A week later, Margaret called with unexpected news. The investigators executed a search warrant. For the safety deposit box? Yes. I held my breath. What was inside? Mostly financial records. And there was also a sealed envelope. Addressed to who? You. My heart skipped. Me. It appears Richard left instructions that if anything happened to him during the investigation, the bank should release it to you. I couldn't understand. If he trusted me enough to leave me a letter, then why file for divorce? Margaret finished. Exactly. The envelope arrived 2 days later. It was still sealed. Margaret suggested opening it in her office. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's. Claire. Asterisk if you're reading this. Then events unfolded exactly the way I feared. Asterisk. I felt tears forming before I reached the second paragraph. Asterisk, you deserved the truth long before now. I convinced myself that carrying this alone was protecting you. Instead, I betrayed the one person who always deserved honesty. Asterisk. I continued reading. Asterisk, Victor approached me almost 3 years ago with investment structures he claimed had board approval. I questioned them at first. Eventually I stopped asking enough questions. Asterisk. That sounded exactly like Linda's description. Asterisk. When investigators began asking for records, I panicked. My advisors insisted divorcing quickly would separate you from whatever happened next. I believed them. I was wrong. Asterisk. I stopped reading for a moment. He hadn't divorced me because he stopped loving me. He had divorced me because fear had replaced judgment. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained it. The final page contained something unexpected. Asterisk, the only person who never lied to me was you. I'm sorry I didn't return that same honesty. Asterisk. Folded inside the letter was a small key. Margaret looked at it. What's that for? I smiled sadly. Our old cedar chest. The one at your house? I nodded. I haven't opened it in years. That afternoon Ethan came with me. The house felt empty. Not abandoned. Just quiet. The cedar chest sat exactly where it always had. In the corner of our bedroom. Inside were wedding albums. Children's drawings. Birthday cards. Letters we'd written each other before we married. Near the bottom was a small envelope with my name. It wasn't part of any investigation. It wasn't evidence. It was something much simpler. A letter Richard had written on our 10th anniversary. I'd forgotten it existed. In it he wrote, asterisk, if life ever becomes so complicated that we forget why we chose each other, promise me we'll remember this day instead of our worst one. Asterisk. I cried harder than I had since the retirement party, not because I wanted everything back, but because I finally accepted that two things could be true at the same time. Richard had loved me. Richard had also hurt me deeply. One truth didn't erase the other. Over the following months, the investigations continued. Federal authorities concluded that several executives and outside consultants had created misleading investment documentation connected to compensation planning. Victor Lang and Mark Ellis faced civil and criminal proceedings related to fraud and falsified financial records. Daniel Mercer was formally cleared. His meetings with Richard had been part of legal reviews after early compliance concerns surfaced, not evidence of wrongdoing. Richard was never charged with stealing company funds. Investigators concluded that while he had failed to exercise proper oversight and had signed documents he should have questioned, There wasn't sufficient evidence that he knowingly participated in the fraud. His reputation never fully recovered. Neither did his career. He accepted responsibility for his failures in judgment and eventually reached financial settlements connected to the civil proceedings. Our divorce took nearly a year to finalize. It wasn't bitter. It was honest. For the first time in a long time, we actually talked. Not as husband and wife trying to save a marriage that had already broken under secrecy, but as two people finally telling each other the truth. The property transfers were largely reversed through the divorce process after the court determined they hadn't been fully disclosed. I received a fair settlement, not because anyone felt sorry for me, but because the evidence supported it. Emily surprised me the most. Months after everything ended, she asked if we could meet for coffee. She looked nervous. "I owe you an apology." I simply listened. I believed Dad when he said the divorce was the only way to protect everyone. She looked down at her cup. "I didn't realize how much he was hiding from you. You helped keep the secret." "I know." Tears rolled down her face. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We can't change what happened." "No. But we can decide what happens next." It wasn't forgiveness all at once. It was the beginning of it. A year later, Ethan and Rachel hosted a family barbecue. There were grandchildren running through the backyard, neighbors laughing over grilled burgers, music playing softly from the patio. For the first time in a long while, life felt peaceful. As the sun began to set, I found myself thinking about that retirement party. I had walked into that ballroom believing I was celebrating the end of one chapter. I had no idea another chapter was about to begin. The divorce papers had felt like the end of my story. They weren't. They were the moment the truth finally demanded to be heard. Justice didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived through patient investigation, honest evidence, and people like Linda who chose integrity over silence. Healing didn't come because everything was repaired. It came because the lies finally ended. And whenever I pass that old cedar chest, I remember something far more valuable than the worst day of my marriage. The truth has a way of taking longer than lies. But when it finally arrives, it doesn't just reveal who betrayed you. It reminds you who you really are.